On 15th of July 2016, Turkey was amazed by the sudden arrival of tanks and troops on the streets. The Turkish parliament in Ankara was bombed, and the presidential palace, also in Ankara, was shelled, and a statement appeared on the military's website claiming that the armed forces had completely taken over the administration of the country to reinstate constitutional order, human rights and freedoms, the rule of law, and the general security that was damaged. This was an attempted coup, and it almost succeeded. When Erdogan appeared on state television, shown here via Al Jazeera, it was via FaceTime on a smartphone. But within hours, called to the streets by President Erdogan and others in the governing Justice and Development Party, AKP, protesters had confronted the coup soldiers, and police loyal to Erdogan had begun to take back control from them. It emerged that the coup was supported by a group within the army rather than supported within the chain of command. And in the days that followed the coup, The Guardian reported hundreds of lives were estimated to have been lost, while the capital was pockmarked with telltale signs of the violence, abandoned tanks, now a curiosity for locals posing on the metal carcasses left in the streets. The government has put the blame on followers of Fethullah Gulen, formerly a supporter of the government. In a piece for Al Jazeera, a leading AKP member of parliament claimed that over the years, this cult infiltrated government institutions, in particular the Education Ministry, Security Services and Judiciary. This rather simple narrative summoned a morally simple nationalism, which could then be used to justify a sweeping crackdown on Erdogan's enemies. As Ayça Çapukçu put it in The Guardian, amid the celebrations, fear also abounds. A massive purge is underway, with more than 60,000 civil servants sacked from the military, the judiciary, the police and the universities. Schools, non-governmental organisations and newspapers are being shut down. Along with civil rights, the European Convention on Human Rights has been suspended. More than 10,000 people have been detained and many tortured, according to independent reports. And indeed, for all the mood of national celebration, there are obvious exclusions in the new spirit of unity. As Al Jazeera reported, while a rally uniting Erdogan and the main Republican opposition was attended by up to 1 million people in August, the pro-Kurdish People's Democracy Party's co-leaders, Selahattin Demirtas and Figen Yüksekdag, were not invited. This is not a minor issue. The reason for the left-wing HDP's exclusion is that it was accused of supporting the terrorist Kurdish Workers' Party, PKK. But the background for this is that the HDP made a breakthrough by gaining 13% of the vote in the national parliamentary elections on 7th of June last year. The Turkish government responded by cancelling the peace agreement that has stood since 2013. It deflected its ongoing operations in Syria, supposedly aimed against ISIS, and turned them, as Middle East expert Juan Cole put it, into a campaign against the Kurds instead. They began a campaign of brutal suppression of the Kurds in the southeast of Turkey, with pogroms and fire bombings on Kurdish headquarters. And having provoked a new conflict with the PKK, it embarked on a series of curfews and sieges of southeast towns and cities, resulting in hundreds of deaths and thousands of displacements. The campaign goes on, even though the PKK has been driven back. As the Associated Press reports, the Turkish government openly boasts that it is cancelling local democracy in Kurdish areas. Turkish government will take over the running of 28 municipalities, ousting elected mayors and other administrators accused of links to the Kurdish rebels, the Interior Minister said. 2,000 have been killed, according to the International Crisis Group, again reported by Associated Press, and local media are being shut down and the infrastructure of the Kurdish representation dismantled. Prior to the coup attempt, most of Turkey's allied states and NATO were making a conspicuous effort to tone down any criticism of its war against the Kurds. When the US State Department spokesperson was asked for comment, he said with strenuous diplomacy, "I'm not in a position to judge it." After the coup, The Telegraph reported on a brief moment of expressed concern from world leaders, urging Erdogan not to use the coup as an excuse for crackdown, without pointing any fingers in the direction of Diyarbakir, the Kurdish city in the southeast. But it was back to business as usual with remarkable speed. When Erdogan met with Obama and Merkel ahead of the G20 summit in September, the Turkish newspaper The Daily Sabah reports the issues discussed included cooperation on regional terror threats, relations between Turkey and the EU, and the refugee crisis, as well as the extradition of Fethullah Gulen, but no mention of Turkey's ongoing war against the Kurds. Likewise, CNN focuses on tensions between Obama and Erdogan over strategy against ISIS, described as an anti-ISIS squabble, without mentioning the war raging in the southeast of Turkey. The outlet mentions differences over Obama's support for Kurdish groups fighting ISIS in Syria. The Independent likewise makes no mention of Erdogan's war on the Kurds. Time only mentions what it calls the Kurdish separatist campaign inside Turkey tangentially in relation to the Syrian war. And the same applies to Reuters in its mention of the Kurdish insurgency, which flared anew following the collapse of a ceasefire between militants and the state last year. One exception is the German newspaper Deutsche Welle, which is covering what it calls Turkey's dirty war against the Kurds, reporting the renewal of disappearances of Kurdish activists at the hands of the Turkish state. In another in-depth piece, it reports from the devastation of the cities besieged by the Turkish military. The historic city centres of Nusaybin, Cizre and Old Diyarbakir have been razed, leaving gaping holes in the cities visible from the air. The entire city of Sirnak has been levelled so that the landscape now resembles Guernica or Homs. It is particularly creditable that it does so despite the official omerta being observed by the studiously pro-Erdogan German Chancellor Angela Merkel. In addition, several journalists at the Huffington Post have covered the war. For example, Akbar Shahid Mohammed protests in the Huffington Post that Obama is letting Turkey target the US's best bet against ISIS by condoning its war against the Kurds. Charlotte Alford, in another piece illustrated with photographs of the devastation, says southeast Turkey increasingly looks like war-torn Syria. Where the war on the Kurds has not often featured prominently in international reporting, Erdogan's anti-democratic measures have. The Wall Street Journal, for example, notes the sweeping scale of Erdogan's university purge, making war on secularists. Most extraordinarily, however, given the context, even in this often detailed reporting of the post-coup crackdown within Turkey, the war on the Kurds is frequently, mysteriously erased. The Wall Street Journal only obliquely brings up the struggle between the government and the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, a designated terrorist group that wants autonomy in majority Kurdish southeast Turkey. The Independent reports that Erdogan favours bringing back the death penalty, promising to destroy terrorists. They will all be cleansed out like a cancer cell. We will find them and punish them. But it strangely fails to connect that to the repression in the southeast. Even in The Guardian, which has criticised Turkey's war on the Kurds and regularly publishes articles critical of Erdogan, the story goes amiss. For example, a piece in The Guardian giving details of how Turkey's brutal crackdown on the media had gone into overdrive mentions the censorship of one Kurdish newspaper based in Istanbul, but the suppression of Kurdish media, including, as Jacobin reports in its piece on silencing Kurdish voices, the television station Özgür Gün TV based in Diyarbakir, is not mentioned. Another post-coup anatomy for The Guardian's long read section by Christopher de Beleg argues, while acknowledging Erdogan's authoritarianism, that for all Erdogan's democratic shortcomings, Turkey's president has neither stolen elections nor launched pogroms against the country's minority Kurdish or Alevi communities. This is simply to write the actual history of pogroms encouraged and condoned by the authorities of the last year out of history. And where there is extensive coverage of the Turkish government's crackdown on the Kurds, as in Israel's liberal Zionist broadsheet Haaretz, it is often tacitly blamed on the Kurds. Reporting Erdogan's bragging about his largest ever operation against the Kurds, with the sacking of 11,000 Kurdish teachers, it refers to the government's campaign against the PKK in the mainly Kurdish southeast before adding, the group, seen as a terrorist organization by the United States, Turkey and the European Union, has waged a 3-decade insurgency that has killed 40,000 people, most of them Kurds. Again, this is a really peculiar revision of history. It is widely agreed that the total killed, both by the insurgency and the Turkish deep state's counterinsurgency, is 40,000. And human rights bodies routinely attribute most of the deaths to the Turkish government's policy of executions, disappearances, and destroying of villages. Quite what could draw Haaretz into tacit sympathy with a government massacring an oppressed national group is difficult to say. To its credit, given its impeccable democratic establishment credentials, the New York Times does manage to fit the war on the Kurds into its coverage of the sweeping post-coup crackdown, which it says has reached witch hunt proportions. Alarmingly to his critics, Mr. Erdogan has recently expanded the purge beyond even the pretense of going after Gulenists, removing Kurdish mayors and thousands of teachers in the southeast. However, consider the ubiquity with which the war on the Kurds just disappears or is downplayed, in particularly the European and US media. It's difficult to resist the conclusion that because Turkey is a NATO ally, which has agreed to help the US bomb Syria and keeps refugees out of Europe, the US and EU are happy to quietly support Erdogan's actions against the Kurds. And that because this repression doesn't matter in the White House, Downing Street, Versailles, and the Chancellery in Berlin, it slips down the agenda for much of the mainstream media as well.